Yeah, I just heard about that.
Yikes. Well, I wonder if that's where he stops. It may be that he put all pressure on them
Yeah.
so that he can get away with this.
Yeah.
And he'll leave it at this and be temperate.
Yeah, yeah, it's very different, you know.
To say, oh, that's okay, that's okay.
Yeah, I've been reading quite a lot of analysis about that. Yeah. What would be the response? I think that's also part of the question.
While you're up here, if you feel comfortable, you can take your mask off.
Oh, we're supposed to.
Yes.
Can I speak? Yeah, okay. Mic is working, right?
Yes, I'm gonna go up and make sure we can hear everything,
Okay.
okay?
Thank you, Rebecca.
So like test 1, 2.
Yeah, test 1, 2, 3.
So how are you enjoying your session?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Students are great.
Yeah, I was a student there once.
Yeah, yeah. You know, they read a lot, coming from, you know, Israel. They actually read, which is a prize of very intelligent.
Can they ask questions?
They ask excellent questions. Yeah, it's definitely very rewarding.
Really,
teaching.
really great. I studied there for years in philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm at the divinity school. Yeah,
I used to love to go to the community school.
It has a great coffee shop, and that's
In the
very
basement.
popular with students in the basement. So that's still there.
Yeah.
So I always tell students that, you know, they come and we convert them to the religion of their choice. It's part of their, but it's very,
Very.
Yeah.
It's a great place to be.
yeah. Yeah.
And so many wonderful scholars come through there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Good. Here, you sit down here. I'll follow you. Reserve the seats.
Yeah. You know, if I sit for a while at a certain point here, you know, going to be on camera, is that fine? Another moment, maybe a little later. Okay. Yeah. We'll discuss. Okay, I can do this from now, but it's. No, I'll just make sure that I'm in the frame. No problem. Yeah. No, I'm fine like this. Just at a certain point, if I put a Q&A, I want to know.
Okay. We can pull, let's pull.
I'll do it for you.
That's all right. Not bad. I'm younger.
I'm sure you are.
Not much.
Yeah, just for the, it's a bit formal to stand all the time.
Good evening, everybody.
Can you go closer to the microphone?
Sure. Here, let's
Go
get
ahead.
this on. Sure. Shalom and welcome to Temple Beth Israel, Rabbi Professor David Barak Gorodetsky. Your accomplishments are many and varied. You are a husband and a father, an agriculturalist, a soldier, and a scholar. Rabbi Professor Gorodetsky is presently teaching at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. As an Israel Institute visiting scholar. And let's note the significance of the Israel Institute, which places scholars in universities all around the world in order to promote the study and understanding of Israel. So we're certainly very fortunate to have you here in Chicago. Back in Israel, David, we're very informal here, teaches at the University of Haifa, where he has risen to become the director of the Rudderman Program for American Jewish Studies. His research, broadly speaking, is focused on the intersection of politics and theology. He studies both the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians, as well as the relationship between American and Israeli Jews. With respect to the Israeli-Palestinian relations, he has lectured on the role of religion in shaping the conflict and also the movement for peace. And it's perhaps no coincidence that he is sensitive to Israeli-Palestinian relations, having received his PhD from the University of Haifa, which has the greatest percentage of population of Arab Israelis, about 40%, I think. In terms of Israeli-American relations, his research asks how the theological beliefs of American Jews provides a lens through which they view Israeli politics. As an expert on Jewish American denominational history, he may know more about us as Reformed Jews than we know about ourselves. But please don't think that Professor Gorodetsky is a one-dimensional scholar, only specializing in all things Israel. He has also studied the religions of the East on his Asian travels, has lectured on the Islamic world of Suleiman II, and has taught Christian poetry and African philosophy. So he is a multi-dimensional religious thinker. Rabbi Gorodetsky was ordained at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Jerusalem. He has led Kabbalot Shabbat services for his congregation on the edge of the cliff of the Ramon crater, also known as Maktesh Ramon, which, by the way, is not a crater, but it looks very much like the Grand Canyon. And since we are told at Psalm 29:8 that the voice of the Lord shook the wilderness of Kadesh, in the region of the Negev close to the Ramon crater, it's easy to imagine that out in the desert, the voice of Rabbi Gorodetsky has intermingled with the echoes of the voice of the Lord. Having been born in Israel and also having lived in South Africa and the United States, it isn't hard to understand Professor Gorodetsky's interest in the Judaism of the diaspora. But if you will indulge me, Rabbi, I think I can trace the origins of your scholarship on American Jewry back to your days as a high school student at the Pardes Hannah Agricultural School, one of the oldest agricultural schools in Israel. You took honors in the cultivation of the avocado tree. And as many of us know who have studied the history of the avocado tree, it was a transplant from the Americas to the Middle East. So it was only natural that by some mystical law of reciprocals, you should become fascinated by those Jews who were transplanted from the Middle East to the Americas. So again, and welcome, and we are really, really proud and honored to have you here, and are looking forward to your discussion of Rabbi Judas Magnus. Thank you.
I must admit this was one of the most well-researched accounts going back to my days in Palestine at the agricultural school. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your kind words. I will say that this is actually the first in-person book event I'm holding. The book is out in September. I've had quite a few online events, but it's actually wonderful to be in person. Even speaking without a mask in person is even one step further, so I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for the invitation, also to Lori and to others. So I'm really honored to be here. I've been in Chicago for 2 years now. This is my second year. I arrived with my family from Israel during COVID. We were actually very lucky to eventually make it over with the restrictions at the time, and it's really been a pleasure. We were extremely concerned about the cold, having come from the desert also, from like other regions, but I find myself, walking outside at 15 or 20 degrees without a jacket, and this is going to be, I think, my main pride and joy of having survived. We thought our limbs would fall off, and that eventually doesn't seem to be happening. I'll get to the topic of our discussion in a minute, and also to the context and the relevance for today, because I think, as much as a historian as I am, I'm also, it begs the question of what is the relevance for today, and it's definitely something I'm planning to address. I also Magnus was a pacifist most of his life. He actually retraces his pacifism he retracts his pacifism in 1939, following the outbreak of the Second World War and Hitler's rise to power. He describes that as a conversion. He describes himself as losing his religion. I just want to acknowledge we are in a tense and perilous kind of time at the moment in relation to war and peace, also in terms of just recently heard news from Russia and Ukraine. So just from the depths of our tradition and I just hope that peace can be achieved and maintained within these very, very difficult conditions, and pray for that. Okay. So what I'd like to do today is three main things. I want to talk about Judah Leib Magnus, who is the protagonist of my book. The book is essentially a biography. So at the end of the day, you always ask yourself, did I get it right? Did I really understand the person? I hope I did. I shed light on a very specific angle, which has to do with his religion and politics, which has to do with the way in which his religious view informs his politics. So I'll discuss his biography for a bit. I'll talk a bit about American Zionism, the early period of American Zionism, maybe in the sense going just back into our history of the support and the non-support of Zionism at the time in which Magnus is involved, and talk a bit about binationalism, which is his main political idea. Binationalism being essentially the idea of two peoples residing in one land, and how do you do that? I'll give you a clue in terms of Magnus. You copy American political institutions and ideas in order to implement that. So that's part of Magnus's agenda. And then I want to talk at the end about current affairs and about how this relates in our time to a few things. First of all, the reemergence of the discourse in binationalism in Israel, mostly in academic circles, but not only. I want to talk about the discussion of liberal Zionism. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with the war engaged in the Jewish world at the moment regarding the term called liberal Zionism and its potential. And obviously, as liberal Jews from the Reform tradition, that's something we feel very passionately about. And then I want to talk about the issue of social justice and the younger generation and how they relate to Israel and to what extent that relates to Magnus. I think I told some of you earlier at the table, I have a student currently at the University of Chicago. She's the daughter of a Reform rabbi, and I had the picture of my book on my door, and she was conducting a tour of the divinity school for new students, and then she told me she was so proud to end at the 4th floor where my office is and to tell them that this was her hero, that Magnus was her inspiration. So I was also approached by another young rabbi from Central Synagogue in New York who invited me to speak about Magnus. Magnus is an inspiration for a certain young generation that wants to blend morality and politics in relation to Israel and Zionism, and I'll get to that as well. Okay? Please stop me if there's any questions, and I'll also stop occasionally to see where we are at, and I'll leave time for Q&A at the end as well. Okay, so who was Magnus? Who was Judah? Magnus? Magnus was born on the 5th of July, actually, 1878. So he used to organize a baseball game in Jerusalem on the 4th of July every day prior to his birthday. That's one of his American traits of his life in Jerusalem. He was born in Oakland, California. He was the first Reform rabbi born west of the Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken. Does that make sense geographically? I keep on saying that. I'm not never really sure what that means, but he was born in Oakland, ordained in Hebrew Union College, Cincinnati in the year 1900. He was the golden boy of the Reform movement at the time, a wonderful orator. There's descriptions of him giving speeches for the survivors of the pogroms of 1903 and 1905, and women throwing their jewelry at his feet when he was raising money. He was this later plays on into the difficulties he had moving into Israel, but he was a wonderful speaker. He finishes his PhD in Berlin in 1902 in Semitic studies, and then he becomes the rabbi of 3 different congregations in New York, always clashing with the board because he was a Zionist, which was not a very popular position within the Reform movement at the time. I'll get to that in a minute. In 1910, he leaves Temple Emmanuel. He's the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel. That's a very famous congregation in New York. In 1910, he retires he gives a Passover sermon on which he essentially calls upon the Reform movement to join the not yet established conservative movement. He calls it non-official reform. He has a category for that. He's also the founder of the Kehila, which is the first kind of umbrella organization for Jewish organizations in New York at the time. So he's, on the one hand, the bridge builder. We'll see some of that in his kind of later kind of discussion, but he's also a firebrand kind of rabbi, passionate about his views. We know those kind of, rabbis within the context of our life and congregation. In 1917, he is one of the founding members of the People Council for Democracy and Peace, which is the main pacifist organization in the U.S. They convene in New York, and he delivers the main speech at the beginning in April 1917. In 1922, he immigrates to Palestine. To some extent, he's actually thrown out of the Jewish American Institution because he was a pacifist. It was a challenging position for the Jewish American Institution that you had a rabbi that once the U.S. joins the war, it's a difficult position to hold, and they kind of, to some extent, push him away. And he immigrates to Palestine, first without a job. He sits under a tree in Kibbutz. I did a lot of work on his religious thought, and this is actually part of his most interesting time in terms of, being inspired by the land and also jobless. So he had a lot of time to contemplate about various things. And then he becomes the first chancellor of the Hebrew University, for which he's very much renowned. He leads the Hebrew University, spurred in many ways by funding from Jewish American donors that made extremely valuable contributions to the establishment of the university. And he keeps silent at this time politically. He's not very involved politically at the time. In 1929, following the outbreak of the events that are called the Western Wall riots in August 1929, he actually says, I can no longer remain silent. That's the prophetic voice we'll also see later on, and publishes a binationalist platform, which is called like All Nations, in which he essentially calls for the establishment of a binational state in Palestine. This is not the view of Ben Gurion or Weizmann or the Zionist leadership at the time. A lot of tension is created around that, but he is very much, again, inspired by, we will see, religious values that we can echo. We can see them echoing in our environment today as well. In the 1930s and 40s, he promotes binationalism in Palestine. In 1946, he testifies before the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, which is the main kind of organ of both these countries at the time to try and find a solution to the situation in Palestine. He testifies in favor of a binational solution. Throughout the 30s, he is involved at certain points with Ben Gurion in creating connections between Ben Gurion and Arab leaders. He tries to promote his visions in so many ways. Eventually, he finds himself in 1948. He's already sick. He lands in New York in March 1948, trying to, again, promote a binationalism solution from here. He meets with President Truman in May 1948, 9 days prior to the establishment of the state, and tries to convince him not to establish the State of Israel and not to support the State of Israel because he believes that would lead to war, and he prefers a binational solution. This is part of how he's remembered in Israel. Israeli historiography it's a bit of a challenging position within that context. Once the state is declared, Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, is in New York at the time as well. They had been clashing for years around the Hebrew University and other institutions. But he goes to meet him. Weizmann is already blind. He goes to meet him in his hotel in New York and congratulates him for the establishment of the country. And he eventually passes away in October 1948, just a few months after that. I would say pretty much disillusioned by the lack of his ability to promote his vision. Heartbroken, some might say. So it's a tragic ending to a contested kind of life that we will see. Any questions so far, just in terms of the data? Yeah. Yeah, his father comes from a Polish Hasidic family. He actually goes to visit his grandfather's grave in 1922 in Poland. It's a beautiful, everybody tries to nickel and dime him by telling him where his grandfather's grave is, and it's actually not there. He gets a bit disillusioned by that as well, but that's part of his, he has a Hasidic orientation on the one hand. He prays in secret in Hasidic synagogues in the Lower East Side and later in Jerusalem. From his mother's side, he's German. His mother is German, so she teaches him the language also as well, so he also later goes on to study in Germany, and part of his relations with the Reform movement also relate to that, because of the German origins of the Reform movement in the US at the time. Other questions? Okay, so this is just in terms of the basic biography. Yeah, so what is Zionism at the time for American Jews? So he's considered one of, especially by Jonathan Sarna, considered one of the early Zionists at the turn of the century, at a time in which Zionism is not that popular in the US, especially not in the Reform movement. So if we look at Has anybody seen this picture before? Are you familiar with this? This is a glass window from a synagogue in San Francisco called She'erit Israel that actually was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake. And what do we see? Just any, this is Moses. Sorry? We see Moses going, this is a bit of a cut from the entire picture, but we see Moses going down to the tribes of Israel who have American flags to some extent, various discussions about what that is. Can anybody identify which mountain he's coming from? Anybody traveled that far from Chicago? That's the Half Dome in Yosemite. Okay, so essentially this is within a synagogue in San Francisco in 1906. You have a picture of Moses going down from Yosemite to the tribes of the U.S., essentially, with the Torah scroll, with the Torah tablets, with the tablets going down. And this, essentially, the Reform movement, especially up until the Balfour Declaration in 1917, did not support Zionism. And this is like a typical text of the time, which essentially says, we are unalterably opposed to political Zionism. The Jews are not a nation, but a religious community. That's the basic kind of understanding of Reform Judaism at the time. Zionism was a precious possession of the past, and as such is a holy memory, but it is not our hope of the future. America is our Zion. Okay? America is our Zion. Here in the home of religious liberty, we have aided in the founding of this new Zion, etc. Okay, so just the earlier period of the Reform Judaism, essentially up until 1935, sorry. It's essentially, there's no formal support of Zionism by the movement until the Columbus Platform, which is later on. Magnus is a Zionist, and he has another view which I also think in many ways I'm not going to read the entire text, but he has another view which in many ways echoes maybe visions we can relate to, or American Jews can relate to in relation to Zionism at the moment. There's a very strong discussion of what is the meaning of Zionism today, and I'll get to that later on. But essentially, what he says, even if you look at the beginning of the quote, for myself, I would say America and Zion. So first of all, there's this idea of two centers. You can have two centers to Jewish life, one in America, one in Israel, and then the relationship between them, relating also to Chad Ha'am kind of cultural Zionism as a vision. And what he says at the other part I've kind of highlighted, Zionism is rather the desire for the live and unhampered and harmonious further development of Jewish nationality and Jewish religion. He has a vision of two centers essentially complementing each other. And which is the vision I think we would all like to see for American Judaism. Israel, are we living up to that aspiration? Probably not, but this is one of the earlier kind of manifestations or formations of American Zionism, which essentially says, again, Zion is the complement to the fulfillment of America, not its alternative. So this idea that you can actually have these two side by side. So Magnus is like a prominent American Zionist at the time. Not so many American Zionists do aliyah to Palestine. You probably heard of Henrietta Sold within that context, which is the other most, let's say, prominent Jewish American leader that immigrates to Palestine. In 1920, Magnus immigrates in 1922. They become close friends. They establish the first Reform synagogue in Israel, essentially Reform conservative in 1923. It's a minyan that doesn't hold that long. It only holds for about 6 months. But they even have Herbert Samuel, who is the British, come in for British, like, how do you call that? I don't remember the exact name of the position. The highest highest ranked, what's the name? High Commissioner. Yeah, the British High Commissioner come into the services, Herbert Samuel, and they establish this synagogue. They have discussions, should we have egalitarian seating? Should women be allowed to pray from the Torah? This is 1923. And eventually what happens to some extent in Israel these days happened then as well. They were kind of co-opted or joined by another more orthodox group of American expats that eventually ran the show, and it became a less egalitarian minyan, and then Magnus left, and as did Henrietta Sold, which complained about needing to sit behind the mechitza. So this is like the earliest example of what the tensions we might know in today's, in Israel in terms of religion and Jewish American life. So what about binationalism? What is Magnus's vision of binationalism? Where does that come from? How is that manifested? This is essentially, in many ways, the core of my argument is the idea that binationalism for Magnus is a platform that is both American on the one hand, in terms of his political thinking, I'll demonstrate that in a minute, but also reform in terms of his political theology. That is to say, reform in terms of the way he understands the relation between religion and politics. Okay? So in 1929, following the breakout of the clashes in the Western Wall, he publishes a pamphlet, or like a booklet, which is called Like All Nations, in which he says the following. I'll quote first of all, the lower part. The Holy Land is no place for an Arab national state or government, or for a Jewish, he says as well, but for a binational country with a mandate as nearly permanent as possible held by Great Britain from the League of Nations. So part of his claim is essentially, this goes into a later discussion, that he says the land is too sacred to belong to any form of nationalism. It's actually a deep ingrained belief in the sanctity of the land, but I think if we look at the first one, this is really what we would expect in terms also of his reform upbringing. So he says the following: it is right in morals, insofar as political forms have anything to do with morals at all, that the people of this and every other country should have a voice in their own government. And it is not possible, even if it were desirable to maintain the present status quo. The Jewish conscience will not bear this for long. It must recognize sooner rather than later, and from goodwill rather than through compulsion, that the inhabitants of this country, both Arabs and Jews, have not only the right but the duty to participate in equitable and practical ways in the government of their common homeland. Okay, so if we look at this, let's say, as the main quote from his binational platform, there's two main things I think that can be understood or stressed. One is this very American idea of democracy and of the rights of people to have a vote and influence on their governance. Democracy, I'll just say, is a challenge for many Jewish American supporters of Zionism at the time, because the Jews are far from being a majority in Palestine in 1929. And a lot of people like Brandeis have to reconcile that fact. So that's claim one, essentially democracy. And the second one is the claim of morals and politics, and essentially the claim that politics has to be just, that morals need to govern politics, that politics should be inspired by moral considerations and moral views, and the Jewish conscience, so to say, would not be able to continue to contain an unjust situation politically. I think, again, not getting into specific political views or these or others, but this echoes a lot of the current conversations about Israel. I'll get to that a bit later on. But essentially what we have here is an American Reform rabbi, born and raised in the movement, moves to Palestine after having been a pacifist in the US, moves to Palestine. At the beginning, he doesn't express his political views. He's a university administrator. You want to get along with everybody. Okay, you're not here to create any trouble. But in 1929, if you look, he essentially quotes the line that I have here, the verse from Isaiah, which says, "For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, for Jerusalem's sake I will not remain quiet," etc. So this goes into the main kind of motif of his kind of religious political thinking, which is the prophetic motif. Okay, he is a Reform rabbi inspired by the prophets, Reform Judaism is called Prophetic Judaism at the time. There is a person called Montefiore from Britain that says that within the Torah arc, you need to have the prophets next to the Torah scrolls. You might even say that you need to remove the Torah scrolls, I'm not sure. But essentially, he gives the prophets equal value. Okay? These are the sources of inspiration of Reform Judaism at the time, and I would argue also up until today. So this is the prophetic voice, essentially. The prophet speaks truth to power. Okay? The prophet is the one that goes to Ben Gurion and says, this is not sustainable. We can no longer continue the situation, etc. Gershom Scholem was a very famous scholar of Kabbalah and a contemporary of Magnus, and a very sharp and not always the most friendliest person, says about Magnus that he has a Jeremiah complex. This is how he calls it, okay? He's like trying to save the world, although there might not be anything to save exactly, but it's like this, it's a critique of his propheticism, which kind of says, Magnus is also perceived in many ways by many in the establishment at the time as like this prophet of gloom and doom that would happen eventually in 1948, when he kind of foresees the outbreak of the war. I'll just say there is another person, that a contemporary of Magnus, that says about Magnus in 1948 that he met him, and Magnus told him, now there will be war for 200 years. Okay, so we still have to disprove that. I'll say that for Magnus's side. So on the one hand, there's a critique of his excessive kind of propheticism, let's put it that way. On the other hand, there is an acceptance or an appreciation of that. A few other things that essentially he addressed in terms of what inspires his binationalism. He has a very strong idea of the sanctity of the land. Again, this also goes into me and the agricultural school in Pardes Chana. But when he comes to the land of Israel in 1924, he's fascinated by the Chalutzim, the pioneers. He's fascinated by Aleph Dalet Gordon, who is like a thinker and like a scholar of agriculture and Jewish renewal. And he talks about the Jewish soil, and he's really, really inspired by that. So that's part of his idea of the land itself and the return to the land, but also an idea of the land being sacred. So that's very strong in his thinking. And in many ways, binationalism is for Magnus like the way to blend Reform universalism, which is essentially the idea that we are part of the nations, and particularism, which is essentially Zionists' idea of a people, a particular people with a particular vision and a particular land. He tries to blend this together essentially by the idea of binationalism, which is supposed to tone down excessive forms of nationalism on the one hand, and inspire them by universal views. And this is generally a view that's held also, for instance, by Abba Hillel Silver, who's a much more outspoken Zionist supporter of the state in the 40s and the 50s. He also holds this idea of a two-phase Zionism. First we create the state of Israel, and then we become a light to the nations. Once we've realized nationalism, to many ways Ben Gurion thinks the same. If you've maybe seen the movie, Ben Gurion's movie Epilogue, which is the lost interview of Ben Gurion, in many ways you can see that in the movie as well. What else is American about Magnus and about his binationalism? So a lot of the binationalists at the time are German, Central European circles, professors at the Hebrew University. There is a part of HaShomer HaTzair, the kibbutz movement, has a form of socialist binationalism. There's an Orientalist binationalism of people that want to go back to the East, it's called Kedma Mizracha. But Magnus essentially represents an American form of binationalism, and you could see some of that, some hints to that in what he was saying. There's a point in which he says, I know this might sound like I'm saying this because I'm American, but why don't we have two houses, like the Senate and the Congress? And one of them would be equal kind of, a parity kind of equal representation for Jews and Arabs, and one of them would be a local, like a general kind of voting. And he's reading the Federalist Papers in 1947. And he's very much inspired by American ideas of the political, also by an idea that I would generally call pragmatism, the idea that you put people together, you get the institutions together, and you create justice within that context. A lot of belief in work and actual kind of implementation of ideas in the land. And again, democracy. Mostly very much, democracy is not the only option of the evolvement of Jewish, political thought at the time, especially within socialist context. But he really wants to implement democracy on the Jewish Arab side, and is very much inspired by the U.S. to do that. So kind of, in that sense, to kind of sum up the discussion of Magnus, what we see essentially is, again, Reform rabbi inspired by religious thinking that originates from the Reform movement in terms of prophetic Judaism, in terms of again, most important, I would say, politics being subjected to justice, and the idea that there is a certain point of time in which he says, and this is of course a contested argument, he says, to some extent, if Zionism can't be moral, then it had better not be realized at all. We can wait, okay? This is a position that's held also by Buber and some other thinkers at the time. So these are the two main things. And in terms of the American influences, again, part of it is an attempt to what's called to Americanize the Yishuv. He's like going to Palestine to essentially Americanize, to implement political ideas, to implement social structures, to implement, various kind of, to many ways, Henrietta Sold is also part of that discussion. So these are kind of the unique kind of aspects that create his binationalism. This is a picture from the 4th of July in the American colony. I don't know if you know, there's a similar picture with Henrietta Sold playing Lady Liberty, but that's not the one I put in. Okay, so any questions about the historical kind of discussion? Yeah.
His idea, if I'm understanding,
Yeah.
was to have the mandate be the government and everyone else be the Congress, basically. And from his mind, there would be peace between or among the various religions. Did I get that?
Yeah. Part of the question is why did, like many other binationalists at the time, he couldn't imagine giving up the British mandate. Even when he imagines a shared government by Arabs and Jews, he still wants the mandate to be here to make sure everything is fine, kind of, to some extent.
That would make some sense if you're talking about, because otherwise one of them has to be the top dog.
Part of the idea of binationalism, and that's the big question of binationalism, can you have a politics with no top dog, right? And can you agree in advance about a political system that says there are two peoples in the land, they receive equal representation of government, and is this sustainable? Can you really, there's something not very practical about binationalism as a political solution. It hasn't been tried in so many places. The places where it works mostly is Belgium, Switzerland, kind of very specific European situations. It's not an idea that really gathered that much support in Palestine. There was very little support on the Arab side. This is in many ways evident from the fact that they were a majority. It's pretty understandable that they didn't necessarily think they needed to concede their majority. That's on the one hand. So it's not very popular on the Arab side. On the Jewish side, again, this is not a majority view. There's a few groups that hold this picture. And one of the critiques of binationalism is, again, the impracticality of that, and the idea that at a certain point one group might try to dominate the other or change the political rules. And can you really create political rules for that kind of government? Sorry. Other questions, thoughts? Yep. I think he is, in the 20s, he's very, especially in the early 20s, he's critical of imperialism at the time. He's also, He's very strongly socialist at the time. He doesn't look at Wilson as a form of inspiration in that period of his life, in the early 20s. There is kind of an internationalist kind of discourse. I will take that does exist, but he supports Eugene Debs in 1920 in the elections. Eugene Debs is a socialist candidate. Magnus is very radical in the years, let's say 1917 until the 20s. He doesn't take cues from anyone in power at the time. He writes at the Eugene Debs Weekly, calling him the only saint in the US. Eugene Debs is a socialist candidate who's in prison in 1920 because when essentially the Socialist Party is outlawed in the US. So I hope that addresses somehow. Yeah, other thoughts, questions? Yep.
I think it's kind of interesting that he was operating at a time when Jews had no political voice in either the United States or Britain. And looking at this picture, it's really interesting to me. There's a British officer, there's a priest, there's no, who knows who the third person is, maybe he's a token American, but there's no suggestion of any Jewish aspect or anything particularly relating even to presence in Palestine of that photo. He was kind of looked at in that regard.
Yeah, there's a few aspects of that. One of them is to go further to say there were never enough boots on the ground within the Zionist, establishment or yishuv to promote certain form of political views that were American Zionist. It's part of the way American Zionists kind of ended up being involved in supporting Israel in various ways, but not necessarily in immigrating to Israel. The other one is, when does the U.S. become a factor in the political life of the Yishuv in Palestine? It's essentially Ben-Gurion in the early 1940s identifies that the U.S. is going to be the up-and-coming kind of power that you need to relate to. Up until then, a lot of people are kind of working with with trying to get solutions from the British, but he identifies that. He waits for 3 weeks in Ellis Island, if I'm not mistaken, until he's allowed to enter New York. This is in 1941. He's like stuck because they don't let him in, but he ends up spending quite a lot of time here because he understands this. And then you have the Anglo-American Committee in 1946, which is the British essentially giving Americans also power in relation to that. But it's true that Brandeis also plays a role in this, because Brandeis does have a certain political kind of... Brandeis leads the Zionist movement around from 1916, maybe for a decade or so, and he does have some political clout on account that he inspires a certain form of American Zionism that has an appeal, but there's not much influence on the ground. I agree with that. Questions? Yeah. I'm not sure. David Ben-Gurion spent 3 weeks, but actually Magnus has a piece where he says something like, "What would be better, to give up my citizenship and live with the lot, share the lot of the common people in Israel, or etc., etc." And there is he continues. I think this is part of also what we can appreciate in his image, and part of the tragic also aspect of his identity. He's never fully integrated into Israeli establishment of society. He is perceived as an American in a context where there are not many American people around. He's very lonely. His Reform Judaism is misunderstood, or he stops calling himself a rabbi. People call him doctor. Part of it has to do with his position at the university, but he's never approached as rabbi. A Zionist leader called Shmaryahu Levin comes to him in 1920 and says, "We know you didn't grow on the knees of Torah." Okay, so even those secular or secularized Jews or Zionists who had left religion but have like still kind of maintain their ties to Orthodoxy and can afford going to Magnus and saying, as a rabbi, and say, you know, that's we don't relate to that idea of Judaism. So that again, part of doing this work on Magnus, and I'll transition now to contemporary affairs because this is we're all going there, right? So part of it is kind of, you know, it's fascinating, disturbing in so many ways to see how like the echoes of concerns that we might have today, you know, popping up so early in the history of Israel and the Yishuv, but it's also illuminating, I think, in many ways towards our times. Okay, so I want to address again. One other thing is to say that there were quite a few Jewish American binationalists. Magnus wasn't the only one. Okay. This is Henrietta Sold on the left. She's more well known, but there's two others. One of them is called Israel Kliger. He's Kliegler, sorry. He's a scientist at the Hebrew University. He's involved with the eradication of malaria, and he's a very prominent scientist. He also supports binationalism at the time. And the other one here, which is more difficult to see, this is a woman called Jessie Samter. She is a poet or poetess, immigrating to Palestine in 1923. She's part of the earlier circle. She's involved also with Hadassah. She lives with her same-sex partner, Leah Berlin, in Rehovot in the 1920s. They moved to a kibbutz, but the kibbutz called Givat Breda, and the kibbutz is not willing to accept their capitalist money that came from the US. And instead of, and what the kibbutz does is it establishes like kind of a wellness center for them to work in the kibbutz, and that's called the Beit Yesha. It exists to some extent until today. She's a fascinating person, also a binationalist. She drives around the country and she writes poetry, and there's actually a book about her that's about to be published here in the US pretty shortly. So she's another interesting figure. So this is just to say quite a few of the Jewish American people or expats or immigrants at the time supported, or Orleans supported binationalism. How does this relate to today? So again, you know, as an historian, I like to think that history has, you know, meaning first in and of itself, but also in relation to current affairs. So I put a few things on here. These two are posters for courses I'm teaching if you want to hop in to the University of Chicago, but it's also to point out a few aspects. So the first idea has to do with a book here on the right, which is by Omri Bohm, which is called Haifa Platform, which is essentially the idea that there's a reemergence of a discussion of binationalism at the time, coming mostly from the claim that the two-state solution is no longer viable. This is a kind of popular political claim that essentially says the territories will never be evacuated. The current situation is unjust, again, in relation to earlier views, and this is, of course, debatable to each direction, but essentially there is a reemergence of discussion that says we need to return to binationalism because the two-state solution is no longer possible technically, and we can't maintain the current situation. And part of that discussion is inspired by Magnus. I actually wrote a review about this book for the Jewish Review of Books that will be published shortly, in which I eventually do not support binationalism at the time in Israel, just to say that, but I can talk about that later on. So part of it is that this idea is back on the table. Okay, binationalism, the idea that you can have the two peoples in one state, how do you manage that, is back on the table. The other idea is, again, is a question of the role religion plays in the conflict. On the one hand, the idea that religion is part of the tension and is part of maybe a cause of the conflict. This is a recently popularized idea by certain historians, which kind of says we didn't notice, but it was a religious conflict all along. Okay, this is one kind of discussion. The other kind of discussion says, you know, this is religion plays such a role both in Israel and in Palestinian society that you can't give up on religion as part of the solution. And you need to find ways to create a religious discourse between Israelis and Palestinians and within Israel in general that will create an alternative to that. And to what extent does American Judaism have a role in that? In offering another political theology, in offering other ideas about religion and politics that could be possibly implemented. So this is Hassin Yatib and Tehila Friedman, these two members of Knesset. There's a feminist side to this. I know Tehila very well. There's a feminist kind of angle to this discussion. These are two Orthodox women hugging in the Israeli Knesset at the day of their ordination, and they were involved in many activities together to promote various issues relating to gender, but not only. And on the other hand, we see religion playing such a dominant role in the conflict. This is in Jerusalem. And the third aspect I wanted to relate to is the issue of Magnus or his views in relation to American Jews today, and especially to the younger generation, especially to, let's say, to students and young rabbis. So I think part of Magnus has evolved into being a form of inspiration for many of these, especially relating to the idea that morality needs to play a role, or a higher role in the politics of Israel, and essentially the idea that especially American Jews need to make efforts to promote a certain kind of discourse about religion and politics in Israel, promoting justice. Justice being such an important aspect of the reform ideology, of the reform self-perception, of Jewish American self-perception, and this is especially by the younger generation relating to movements of social justice, wokeism, and whatever is also happening in the US at the moment relates to that. I will say that there's also tensions around that. That's not always a very popular view amongst Israelis, who sometimes would claim that those kind of morals are not always applicable in the kind of situations that arise in Israel, are not necessarily, they don't take into acknowledge sovereignty and the requirements of sovereignty in the running of a state or political institutions. But this is obviously, again, open for grabs or for further discussion. So I kind of wanted to tie this back to contemporary affairs, and to end with this vision of Magnus as also as an inspiration for a certain generation of young Reform Jews, and to open it there, let's see, I'd love to hear a few of your thoughts just as we conclude in terms of what does this mean today? How does it relate to current ideas, to Jewish American life? What are your thoughts on that? So that's my concluding discussion. Okay. I can leave that open, that's fine. Okay, I'll sit down for a few minutes now, okay? And take your thoughts. Yep.
Is this mostly an academic discussion, or is this come into the Knesset in any way?
The binationalism
Yes.
discussion? Maybe I will stand. Okay, so the question is the reemergence of binationalism mostly an academic discussion? On the one hand, yes, and it's a popular discourse also in academic circles. They don't necessarily need to address the implications of such a view. It hasn't necessarily been translated into a practical political platform. Even if you look at Omri Bohm's book, it's more a kind of a claim about, what needs to be, but less of a program of how to implement it. And having been a scholar of this topic for a while, I know that, the devil is in the details in binationalism. And that's part of the pragmatic kind of, aspect of it not being kind of implemented. There is something which is called the Haifa Platform. Actually, again, going back to Haifa, I'll just say a few words about Haifa. Haifa is historically a Jewish Arab city, a big Arab population, quite a big Christian population. Historically, also a stronghold of the Communist Party that did a lot of aspects of Jewish-Arab cooperation. There is something which is called the Haifa Platform from 2007, which is actually, on the one hand, it's a call for a binational state, but it's understood by many others, including myself, as essentially a call for one state Palestinian solution. And again, looking into the details, that's a bit of a tangent. So part of the concerns about binationalism sometimes is that it's actually giving up the idea of a Jewish state to much extent, and calling for, like, you know, certain in terms of demographics. If again this goes into the Jewish Arab demographics, if you include the territories or the West Bank and Gaza, then the current situation, this is debatable, but it's probably around 51% Arabic and 49% Jewish. Again, this is really in the small details, but it's pretty even. This is one other thing to say, just in terms of part of the discussion of binationalism. There's no political party promoting it or something of that kind. Yeah.
Highly impractical, especially now. I don't see, once the state is established, I don't see Israelis giving it up. And why would they trust the Arabs? The Arabs, some of them
Yeah.
I
I teach at the University of Chicago, so I meet a lot of students with varied political views, and there is a very, very strong movement on campuses which generally understands, let's say, the situation as unjust to an extent that eventually requires giving it up, right? I'll just say this, and I've always been in the belief that that's not a practical way to go in any terms. You know, you can promote, even if you think that binationalism is like this ultimate kind of morally pure kind of, you know, solution that will be just. The idea of part of what Omri Boehm does in the book is trying to convince essentially Israelis that you know, we need to move to a new phase and Zionism is over. But I don't see any way in which, on a practical perspective, you could convince Israelis to give up the state. And I think that in many ways, you know, solutions have to be found within, like, a practical, pragmatic understanding of nationalism, of Zionism, hopefully with a just solution for the Palestinian situation as well. This is essentially the two-state solution in the eyes of many. Essentially, you know, the idea that you can have some form of Palestinian state together with some form of an Israeli state. I do also understand the concerns about whether that is that still practical or not. Like the current situation in terms of the number and the sprawling of the settlements within the West Bank is to an extent that it's reasonable to believe that that's also, like, intractable. You can't really move 400,000 people in so many kind of places out. So what do we do? Again, I don't have any solution. This is, again, just to say that this is an inspiration for one of the views as a solution. Yep. I'll say something about those days and I'll say something about today. There's a famous story about Magnus. Tom Segev tells this. Magnus meets a Christian intellectual called Sakakini at the Shepherd Hotel in 1942. And he tells Sakakini, I'm really inspired by your books, and I want to talk with you about binationalism. And then Sakakini tells him a story. He tells him a person is riding a donkey, and then he sees a hitchhiker. And he lets the hitchhiker go in the back of the donkey, and then they're both riding together, and then the hitchhiker says, how fast your donkey is. And then they continue walking, and it's great. And then after a few minutes, the hitchhiker says, how fast our donkey is. And then the driver says, well, you need to get off, because next thing you're going to say, how fast is my donkey? Okay? This is 1942, a middle-of-the-road intellectual, Christian intellectual called Sakakini, who saved Jews in the 1921 events in Jerusalem, very well renowned for that, very well respected. And that's a very kind of point-blank kind of, aspect of Palestinian nationalism that we can understand. I will say that there were some supporters of binationalism. One of them is called Musa Alami, who's also a Christian. That's also part of, it's a recurring pattern that a lot of the supporters are Christian. Some might say that the platforms I described, the 2007 Haifa platforms, are call, if you read them, like, literally to some extent, they're a call for a binational solution. I think there is a lot of suspicion on both sides around this issue. And then the question is that really a support of binationalism, or is that like a guise for promoting eventually a Palestinian state? So that's the deepest concern about binationalism. It's like the underbelly of binationalism. You need such a level of trust between the two sides in a binational solution. I'm not sure Israelis and American Jews can agree about a binational solution for the state of Judaism, okay? Because everybody's always concerned that the other side will grab at a certain point more. It's a very, that's a structural problem of binationalism. There is actually, currently, I just saw some research about a scholar that did support binationalism. I need to read into that at the time, but again, it's doubtful whether, and I will even say that regretfully, that I think some of the potential support of that has also been eroded even in May 2021, because especially in places like Haifa, and Akko and like joint cities, there was a lot of tension, and it eroded some of the, let's say, grassroots potential support for those kind of solutions. I will say something on the other side, which relates to the current government, and I don't know to what extent you're aware of this, but within the Israeli government there is a Muslim Orthodox party called Ra'am, which is the first time ever that you have an Arab party, and it didn't end up to be the secular Hadash party, which is very much associated with Haifa, by the way, but it ended up to be a Muslim Orthodox party, which is actually might be a concern for Reform Jews in America, because there's actually support of certain, let's say, religious policies in which they share views with the Orthodox. But it also demonstrates, I think, on a deeper level, and I am involved with work relating to this, also the idea that there can be a religious form of support for coexistence within the context of Israel as a state that acknowledges the state, and this has been part of the wordings used by Abbas Mansour, who is the head of that party. He was in many ways the first Arab politician to acknowledge the existence of the state of Israel within to a surprising kind of degree. And the way that this is inspired by religious ideas that say we can exist here as a religious minority with rights, without political rights, is pretty promising to some extent. Again, everything is up for grabs at the moment in Israeli politics, as it always is, but I will say that there's something there that's inspiring. Yeah, Lori.
You had said something earlier about there being some interest among young Americans in the legacy of the Magnus. Is that exist anywhere outside of the U.S. among young people?
again, part of it is within the rabbinical schools. So again, especially Hebrew Union College. I haven't had, hordes of or crowds of younger, people knocking at the door, kind of, it's not that it's necessarily, as prominent at the moment as are certain issues about internal Jewish, internal American affairs. I will say that, you know this better than I do, but I'm engaged with these people on a regular basis. They are very much concerned with the situation within the U.S. at the moment, and Israel is in many ways, actually understood as something that possibly endangers their aspirations within the American society. And then within that context, a person like Magnus is essentially, I've had a student say something, he said this about Chadam, but it's the same idea. Essentially, this is this is a Zionism I can relate to, okay? There was a blog called the Magnus Zionist, which it's still active, but that was also like a source of inspiration, essentially an avenue for people to say, this is the kind of Zionism I can relate to because it relates to my American values. And to that extent, I think that there is potential there in promoting that kind of discourse, also in giving it a bit of a longue durée of history, that you can see that, those views had existed earlier. On the negative side, I will say that they haven't been that effective, okay? It's not going to be necessarily an immediate success story in terms of selling that kind of Zionism today. Yep. Yeah. I think to some extent that question rose surprisingly around COVID. There was this idea that COVID is this common enemy of everything. It's an interesting, thought how that would transpire in terms of having a common enemy and relating to that. I will say maybe, again, I think we need to conclude, so just let me know. I'm assuming it's 8 is the cutoff time, but I will say, and this goes into really contemporary affairs in terms of the situation in America and Israel. I am concerned about the extent to which polarization in America can possibly affect Israel, actually. From the way I see it now, and I've been writing about this actually recently, there's a lot of research about the extent to which American polarization is at the highest level since there's various kind of indexes of polarization. And I think that Israel, especially Israel in general, but maybe even just the Jewish society in Israel itself, for the sake of discussion, I don't think it can afford that kind of polarization for long. I think I'm not sure the U.S. can afford that kind of polarization. That's your call. But I will say that level of polarization within Israel would be extremely concerning from my point of view. So what I would, in terms of unity, what I am promoting in terms of what I'm working on politically now is conservative liberal bridge building in Israel. I encourage you to do the same. I know how difficult it is. This is just to say that I think, part of the work that needs to be done is finding ways to do the bridge building between these two kind of worldviews and the extent to which that is important in Israel. Yeah, there was another question?
I was just going to say, it's interesting that you saw the United States as a model, and this is where we've ended up, because that's such a model. It's not, it hasn't been so sustainable.
Yeah, I'd love to have that discussion as an entire, you know, I'm doing a lot of work and talking with a lot of students about that as well. I think there still is a lot of inspiration to be taken from America, you know, both at the time and now. But I will also say that, you know, current concerns are
I guess I'm, you know, you're skeptical of simple capitalism. And I think people are being really strict on something almost people are freaking out. And I think what's caused this great resurgence of ultra nationalism of white people, let's say, in America, has been violence against people of color. And I think that's why I'm hoping binationalism work, because there's tribalism, even more tribalism in some countries than we have in the United States. There is a tribal people. And I just think these areas should be advanced.
yeah. I'll address that just to conclude within the religious kind of framework, and this is to say that this is one of the main critiques of the Oslo Accords, just for the sake of discussion, that it didn't take religion enough into account. This is the heydays of secularism, pre-post-secularism of the 1990s. This is but essentially, if you look at Israeli and Palestinian societies, religion plays a very important role in both societies. And with it, including its tribal contexts, and including its particularist contexts, and we need to take that into account. It's not, there's not going to be a liberal or a purely liberal, you know, kind of solution. It's actually from where I'm looking at the situation. Again, there's a concern. We want to maintain liberal, you know, values, liberal achievements. It's you know from this country how complicated things are. But this is just to say, within the context of our discussion, again, religion needs to be factored into as part of the solution, and the value that can be achieved by. I'll just give one example for this. Essentially, there is a Muslim idea of Hudna and various other ideas that say we can have an ongoing ceasefire or truce that is renewed each and every time, and that's supported by the religion. From a liberal point of view, that's not peace. Okay? But honestly, I'm not that concerned. You know, it might be that if you can create kind of discourse in which you have a renewal without a formal peace as a long-term agreement, that's not necessarily bad, just in terms of thinking religiously about those kind of solutions. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it. About what, sorry? Yeah, I need to look back into that, but yeah. So you need to remind me of the dates. I just want to make sure. But essentially, a lot of my sorry. Great. Okay, Mondays are good. So essentially, I'm a lot of my work also has to do with the history of the Reform movement in Israel. I've published some on that, mostly in Hebrew. But essentially, I want to look into, again, building towards where we are today. I want to look into the history of the relations between the Reform movement and Israel. There's an earlier history that has to do with the 30s and the 40s, the establishment of Israel. And then there's various tensions that build up, a lot of religion and state issues that relate to things that we are addressing today, gender-related, etc. So I kind of want to take us through the journey of moving from the earlier history of Reform movement in Israel to where we are today. What are the lessons that can be learned from that earlier history, and how that can hopefully inspire us towards a better future in that relationship. Okay, thank you.